All right, we're live. Hey everyone, we're just gonna see we have around 75 people in the room. Gonna wait for like I think 1 or 2 more minutes to let people come in. Maybe they're switching meetings or stuff just to make sure. In the meantime, people entering the room, feel free to just say hi in the chat. Maybe introduce yourselves quickly so we can see who's here. That would be really nice. Let's see in the chat. Hi, folks. Hi, Alexander. All right, we got already 66 people coming in. That's nice. Gonna wait 1 more minute just to make sure. All right. Got around 70 people. I think we can get started. Hi, everyone. Thanks for introducing yourself in the chat. That's very nice. Okay, so first off, today we're chatting with Brett Stulberg. Hey, Brett.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for making the time out of your day to join us.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about groundedness. We'll dive deeper into that later. Just a quick intro about me and Alan. So I'm Steph. I will be hosting. And about Alan, Alan is a one-stop health partner. So we offer health insurance, medical advice, prevention, mental health coaching to improve the well-being of your employees and to help them perform better. We do that in Belgium for companies like Sodexo, IBA, Mitra, Nationale Loterij, Exo, and many more. And globally, we have around 400,000 members. And quickly about Brad. So, Brad is a researcher, writer, and coach on mental health, excellence, and sustainable success. His latest books, The Practice of Groundedness and Peak Performance, have sold more than 350,000 copies and have been translated into more than 20 languages. The man of the hour, Brad. How are you?
Hey, Steph. It's great to be here.
Cool. Brad, maybe before we dive into like the deeper stuff on groundedness, maybe it would be interesting if you could do like a share a bit of a personal story because of course you wrote this book on the practice of groundedness, but what happened in your life that we got there?
Yeah, so there were two phenomena, I guess, that you could say that I was a part of in my own life that really led to the creation of this book. So the first was personally. Around 6 years ago, seemingly out of nowhere, I began suffering from a pretty bad anxiety disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, often known as OCD. And for the better part of a year, it was quite debilitating for me. I was not very grounded. I was not a peak performer. I struggled in my own work. I felt a whole lot of imposter syndrome because I had at the time written this mega best-selling book on peak performance. And then here I was really suffering and struggling. And during that process, the farthest thing on my mind was writing another book. I just wanted to get better. I was working with a therapist, and thank goodness she was very skilled. And over time, the therapy had an enormous impact. But on the other side of that, I started to intellectualize the experience, I guess, and try to figure out what, if anything, perhaps environmentally might have been going into it. And then more importantly, what were the tools that I learned in my own process that perhaps I could share with others. Now, concurrently, in my coaching practice, so many of my clients were reporting to me their own feelings of anxiety, perhaps not at the same clinical level, but lots of restlessness and distress and exhaustion and an inability to turn it off and burnout. And these were people that, conventionally speaking, were quite successful. They were leading very significant companies here in the United States, Fortune 500, even Fortune 100 companies, a global partner at a big law firm, right? These were people that when you would look at their resume, you'd think that, wow, they've got it all together. They're super successful. But then in our coaching sessions, they often felt like they were barely hanging on. So my personal kind of lack of groundedness and then rebuilding it, along with seeing that all of these very successful coaching clients also felt their own version of frantic and frenetic energy in their lives, that was the seed of the idea. And then I couldn't not see it everywhere. I began to see data that showed at the time, this was before the pandemic, the global economy was in a better place than it had ever been at the time. Yet leading indicators of well-being and happiness were some of the worst on record since they've been recorded. So there was this big dichotomy between outward performance and what was happening underneath. And that was the genesis of this book that aimed to kind of figure out A, what's going on with that gap, and then B, propose a solution so that we can strive and innovate and grow, but do it in a more fulfilling, wholesome, nourishing way. And that's the book.
Yeah, it's super interesting to see that evolution from peak performance to something like the practice of groundedness. And I can only imagine that what that must have done for you and people around you. Um, I'm interested also, we're talking a lot in this context about burnout. For example, even in Belgium here, we've seen a rise of about 66% in the amount of cases of burnout in the last 3 years. So it's a huge problem. Like, what do you think is causing this problem? Why is it happening?
I think that it's a handful of factors that are converging at the same time. So first, let's get pre-pandemic. So before COVID, okay? Even before the pandemic, the boundaries between work and life started to blur. I think you really trace this back to, you were probably a kid then, Steph, when the BlackBerry came out. And suddenly people were told that, hey, this is great. It provides all this flexibility, which is true, but it also puts a highly charged computer in your pocket at all times. So it used to be that you would drive to the office and drive home, and you would work and then you'd stop. And now you had the potential to engage 24/7. And even if you weren't consciously working, so long as that phone was in your pocket, you might be thinking about your email or wondering what's happening or feeling the urge to dive into work. Now, fast forward to the pandemic, and for many people in many places across the world, those boundaries got even blurrier. During periods where there was a shift to work from home or completely remote work, there was no more commute to the office and commute back. There was no more Monday to Friday. It all just kind of blurred. And I want to be really clear. These aren't just bad. For many people, they're great. For working parents, for people with really long commutes, for people with disabilities that struggle to commute, this kind of blurring of the boundaries and work from home is wonderful on the one hand, but it comes with these negative effects that is, you're never really not at work. It's kind of this blur. And this is all very new. 30 years ago, you would go to the office and you literally couldn't take work home. You can't take a PC home. And I think that even though it feels like a long time for us in this generation and the generation before mine and yours and the young ones after, this feels super, super long. But when you zoom out and you look across history, this is like the industrial revolution, this change, and it's still in its infancy. So I think that ultimately that's what it was. And just for the third time, so I'm super clear in the most American explicit way, I don't think this is all bad. I think there's a lot of good that comes from these devices and our ability to kind of tune in and tune out and be flexible. I just think that we went all in on it without realizing the potential for negative consequences. And now we're learning how to deal with them.
Interesting. In the book, you mentioned specifically this idea of heroic individualism as like a big driver of some of these problems. Can you explain that quickly?
Right. So heroic individualism is the term that I came up with to describe a pattern of behaviors and feelings that are not a clinical disorder. It's not depression. It's not anxiety. but that leave people feeling more rattled than they'd like. And it's my belief that heroic individualism leads to burnout. So I define heroic individualism as a constant game of one-upsmanship against yourself and others. And the most important part is this: the goalpost or the goal is always 10 yards down the field. Mm-hmm. So however far you've come, it's never enough. You always want more. And again, this is non-dual. This isn't just a bad thing, right? This is what leads founders to start companies. It's what leads to innovation and scientific discovery and great art. And it can set people up to never feel content or never feel fulfilled. And as a result, you see people that experience a lot of restlessness in their life. As I mentioned, they struggle to step away from their work and take breaks. They might be really successful on the outside, but on the inside, they feel lonely because their whole life has become just kind of this perpetual rat race for more, more, more. And again, what I try to do with groundedness here is marry this innovation and growth drive, this hunger to want to get better and improve and do meaningful work, which I firmly believe is a good thing, but take away some of the feelings of lack of fulfillment and restlessness. At the risk of sounding woo-woo, I think this is ultimately the difference between playing from a place of fear and compulsion or insecurity versus playing from a place of love and freedom. And the result could be the same thing, but how you get there and how you feel along the way is totally different. So there's a mountain on the cover of the book. You can see there's a mountain behind me. I love mountains. I live in the mountains, and I think they're the most beautiful metaphors. And here you could imagine two climbers. And one climber really wants to get to the top of the mountain, and they're constantly worrying about what will happen if they don't. They're telling themselves a story that if they do get to the top of the mountain, then their self-worth will be validated. They'll be able to post about it on LinkedIn and Instagram. All their friends will love them. They'll be a hero. The other climber equally wants to get to the top of the mountain, but that other climber is less obsessed with what the peak will be like and is more present for the climb. They're focused on the process. Perhaps they're doing it in a group of people. They're even enjoying the view from the side. And what the research shows, both in actual climbing and metaphorically, is that that second climber has a better chance of reaching the peak, and B, a much more chance at a sustainable career. So it's ultimately about how do we climb in a way that is grounded versus constantly feeling that need to strive to get to someplace out ahead of us.
Yeah, I love that. It's interesting how these concepts are not like absolute, but it's really a lot about this spectrum of where on the one hand you have the person going extreme to looking at that outcome and the other person being more grounded. That's very interesting. Maybe one more question around burnout, and I think then we can dive really deep into the concept of groundedness. Yeah. What are some of the biggest misconceptions you see about burnouts? Because obviously we're talking a lot about it, but what are some of those things that you think are really misconceptions?
Yeah, so I think the first misconception is the most important, which is burnout is a spectrum, and it happens slowly and then it happens fast. So someone can be irritated, kind of apathetic about their work, but just like phoning it in and doing the best that they can, given that they don't feel well. But then something could happen in their personal life, or something could happen in the workplace that just kind of flips the switch. And then suddenly that person is totally unmotivated and feels pretty crappy. And if that's not addressed, then true clinical depression can follow. So I think that it's important to realize that burnout isn't just a yes or no thing. It's this wide gradient, this spectrum. And ideally, we want to get as upstream of it as possible and nip it in the bud during the early onset. I think another misconception about burnout is that, oh, when you're burnt out, you can't work. That's not true. My guess is that most people experiencing burnout, they still show up for work. It's just that their performance suffers and how they feel internally while they're working suffers. So I'm sure that many people on this call, perhaps you've personally experienced it, or maybe you've dealt with colleagues that have, where you're still showing up, but you don't really care. Versus a year before that, when you were really invested and the work was fulfilling and you were proud of it. Um, but to the outside observer, hey, this person's still coming into the office, or they're still responding to emails, they're still doing their work. And I think that's why it's really important that now we have some language for this, because we can try to address it before it tips over into something that is observable. Because once you can see that someone is burnt out, it's probably too late to intervene in a way that's going to have a fast effect. Now, not all hope is lost, but instead of getting someone on the right track in a day or two, it might take a week or a month to get that person back on the right track. And then I think the other big misconception about burnout is that it can happen to people even if they like their work. So an occupational hazard of loving your job is that you just push, 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 and then suddenly your significant other in your marriage starts saying, hey, I want more of you. Or your child starts looking at you and saying, Mom, Dad, why are you on the phone when we're supposed to be playing? And you just push, 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 and you're moving so fast, and it feels good because you're accomplishing a lot and you like your work. And then suddenly one day you wake up and you're like, crap, like, what have I done to myself here? I'm so singular. I'm so unidimensional. There's nothing else to me. And that person might, even at that moment, like their work, but start feeling burnt out. So those are the two biggest misconceptions. It's invisible before it's visible. And even if you love your work, without any boundaries, you still put yourself at risk.
Yeah, love that. And I want to pick on that idea of like nipping it in the butt. Like we at Allen also were really obsessed about this idea of prevention versus curative solutions. And we also were also firm believers that mental health coaching and giving yourself exercises and tools can really make a difference earlier on rather than solve the problem when it arises. So I'm happy to hear that. Maybe let's dive a bit deeper into the concept of groundedness. First off, what does this mean to be grounded?
So groundedness is the second climber. It means that you are firmly situated in the process of striving for whatever goal you're after. So it doesn't mean that you check out and you move to a monastery and you let go of all worldly things. There's nothing wrong with that, but that's not what groundedness is. Groundedness is about staying in the world, continuing to strive, wanting to be excellent in the things that you care about, but doing it in a way where you are on the mountain experiencing the climb versus just obsessed about the peak down the road. Ultimately, that's what it is. And there is such a difference between being firmly in the process of striving versus obsessing about the goal. And when you're firmly in the process, you experience much less burnout. When you begin to feel those feelings of burnout, you adjust because you say, hey, my process isn't working. Whereas if you're just obsessed on reaching the peak, nothing else matters. And to play this metaphor to the fullest extent, in the climbing community, there's something called summit fever. And summit fever is when a climber is so obsessed with getting to the peak, they make decisions that are reckless. So they'll continue to try to summit even when the weather conditions aren't permitting. And it's a really dangerous thing. What often happens is people will reach the peak, but then they never come down because they took too big of a risk and they get caught up in bad weather and they lose their lives. Now, that's the extreme end of this metaphor in real climbing, but I think that it relates to burnout. Whereas if we are so obsessed with the peak, we'll do anything we can to get there. And then even if we get there, on the other side of it, we find ourselves in really a bit of harm in a lack of feeling of fulfillment. So groundedness is just about being in the process and striving in a more wholesome, nourishing, sustainable way.
Yeah, I love that. And I guess also like when you are grounded, and again in the metaphor of climbing, I think you're much more paying attention to the signals around you. Maybe snow is sliding and you can pay attention while you're so obsessed looking at that peak, you might not notice that you're going in the wrong direction. So I think it's also, it helps you to adjust. And I think that's very important. You talk in the book about pillars. I don't know. I think it's 7 pillars, right?
Yeah, there's 6.
6, but I don't think we have time to do all of them. But maybe could you share like 3 or 4 pillars that are like super important and interesting also from a perspective of people in a company, HR, business owners, that sort of.
Yeah, I think that, well, they're all really important, but The first one is to accept and see clearly where you are to get where you want to go. And I think often we do a little bit of delusional thinking or magical thinking where we want things to be a certain way. So we start to see them that way, even if they're not. And if we can't see a situation clearly, then any effort to work on that situation or improve it is futile because we're not actually working on the thing that we need to work on. So the first principle of groundedness, and there's all kinds of practices in the book here, is to learn to see your situation clearly, even if you don't like what you see. That's okay, right? We're humans, we're imperfect. We're all going to have experiences during our life where things are not as we want them to be. And particularly in the West, I think Americans suffer from this maybe worse than anyone. We like pretend that things are fine even when they're not, because that short-term pain of realizing they're not scares us. But the long-term pain of not seeing problems where they are is much greater. So this first principle is acceptance. The second principle is presence. So be present and own your energy and attention. I think particularly in today's world of social media and 24/7 news coverage and the attention economy, there's all this novelty and stimulation that is prying for our attention. And it can leave us kind of scattered, right? We're bouncing from one thing to the next. We're checking our email. We're going to Twitter. We're going to LinkedIn. Oh, crap, there's a global event I should know about. Back to work. And what the research here shows is that the more that we do that kind of very quick novelty task switching, the worse that we feel. And of course, the worse that we perform. That's a given. So the second principle of it is really important, is this notion of really cultivating your ability to own your attention and to channel it in the directions that you want. So you want to be in control of your attention. You don't want the things around you to control it. The third principle that's worth talking about is vulnerability. I think especially for this audience of people that are leaders in HR and people organizations, you know, we're all humans. So everyone goes through stuff. And I think that when we can accept that, back to acceptance, and we can realize that about ourselves and others, we give people the benefit of the doubt. We show more compassion to others and to ourselves. And it really allows us to connect more with other people. So there can be this huge switch between someone that might be experiencing a lot of burnout or distress and not feeling well, and they feel like that's not known about them. The minute that they can share that and they feel like that's known, A, that person starts to feel better, and B, their trust in the organization and in their team goes way up. So it's this concept called psychological safety. Many of you have probably heard of it. I think the shortest way to explain it is that we think that in order to be vulnerable with someone, we need to really trust them. But what the research shows is actually the way that we build trust is by being vulnerable. This is so important for leaders and organizations who might think that they need to hide all their flaws. There was just a research article in the Harvard Business Review Journal that talked about leaders that are seen as most powerful are those that are flawed and that don't try to hide their flaws. That is so important. So this notion of being vulnerable, and even if it feels icky when we're doing it, on the flip side of it, it builds strength. One of my favorite studies that I write about in detail in the book came from researchers at the University of Manningham, which is a university in Germany. And for a study, they paired up people to have conversations, and they instructed the people in the conversations to share really intimate details about their lives. So experiences of mental illness, experiences of burnout, divorce, grief, failure, things that you don't normally share with a conversation partner. And afterwards, they polled both people, the person doing the sharing and the person that was listening and receiving. And what they found is that the person doing the sharing, they reported not feeling good. They felt weak, they felt insecure. But the person on the receiving end, they rated the conversation very highly. They said that they respected their conversation partner, that they trusted that person, and even that they look up to that person, that they'd be willing to go to that person for advice, excuse me. So the researchers from the University of Manningham, they coined this the beautiful mess effect, because we're all kind of like beautiful messes. And that's what makes us human. That's what allows us to connect to others. So I think for leaders in the corporate world that think that they have to be all buttoned up, it's a really powerful study to say, hey, that might not be so true. And then the last principle worth talking about is physical movement. So the first 5 principles in the book, they're all psychological tools and mindsets. And when I was writing the book, my editor said, well, it feels a little bit weird to just like throw exercise in here. And I said, it might, but it would be intellectually dishonest not to, because the research here is so compelling that if you could bottle physical activity up and make it a pill, it would be GlaxoSmithKline's #1 seller, GSK, whatever, COVID, Paxlovid. No, exercise would sell more than anything because its impacts are so broad for physical health, for mental health, for emotional health, right? So we have this tool, which is moving our bodies, yet so many people sacrifice it because they think they need to work more. And what I argue for in the book is that whatever our job may be, we should think of physical activity, physical practice, exercise, not as something that we do as a sacrifice, but as a part of our jobs. So everyone knows that an athlete thinks of training as a part of their job, but I think that you can be a CEO at a company and exercise ought to be a part of your job. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to run marathons or do CrossFit or throw the discus, right? It can be a brisk walk. Actually, the research shows that brisk walking gets you most, if not all of the way there. So this isn't about becoming Superman or Superwoman. This is simply about moving your body, which is so important for knowledge workers because the impact on mental health and physical health, the ability to focus, the ability to problem solve is so strong. So if I had to choose 4, I think those would be it: acceptance, presence, vulnerability, and movement.
Yeah, love that. And actually, since I read the book, I have this slot in my calendar weekly, like that says go running or do something, and it really helps to block the time and just make it, as you said, part of your work. Sorry for the sun, by the way. I'm still here, but it's it's a bit blurry. Love that.
We're talking about groundedness, and you look like the Buddha. You know, you're
Voilà.
just
Enlightened. No, also one pillar we didn't mention, but the one that I found also very important. For example, at Allen, we're working a lot remote. You have that option, but you mentioned community as being a very important part, and the fact that Alan, that we have these bi-weekly, we get together a lot. There's a lot of opportunity to talk to people and be among other people. Really helps to not feel isolated from that, and that's something you also described in the book, community. Maybe you could quickly elaborate on that before we move to the next part.
Yeah, I talk about in the book, I coined this term deep community because I think that it has 2 important elements, and one is sometimes overlooked. So the first element is just being in person with other people that care about you and that you care about. That is really good for us. We know this, right? Unfortunately, there was this massive natural experiment, the coronavirus pandemic, and we saw what happened to rates of loneliness and isolation and depression. And a large part of that was the fact that at a time when the normal thing to do, it's scary, people are becoming ill, is to reach out for community, that became dangerous. So we know that community and being in person with people is really important to our thriving. But the second part is equally important, which is not physical, but psychological. It's a feeling of belonging to something that is greater than yourself. It can be an organization. It can be a lineage. It can be a religious tradition. It really doesn't matter what it is, but we have to feel like we belong. So for leaders of organizations, I think that you get to work on this from both angles. One is, even in a hybrid world with all the benefits of working from home, as Steph mentioned, the benefit of bringing people together at planned times, I cannot be overstated. I think it's worth every penny to do that. On the flip side, if you're not going to be in person every day, the more that you can create that psychological sense of belonging, that feeling of shared mission, of shared values, not just as some poster on the wall, but really something that your organization stands for and that people get to show up and practice every day, the more people will feel like they belong to something, the better they'll perform, but more importantly, the better of it they'll feel. And in the West, we've seen a pretty stark decline and organized religious traditions. And I'm agnostic to that. I think that for some people, religion is great. For others, it's not. So that's not my point. My point is, though, there was this thing that used to be this built-in sense of belonging and in-person interaction. You felt connection to a tradition, and you showed up to church or the mosque or to synagogue, whatever it is, once a week. And now that that is on the decline, and for many people, that's not a part of their life, well, what's going to replace it? And we kind of have to do the hard work of building those communities. And for some people, the workplace, depending on the company, fills that role. For other people, they need it elsewhere. But I think that it has to be present. Otherwise, we start to feel a little isolated. Like it's a huge universe, and it's nice to know that we're a part of something a little bit smaller.
Yeah, 100%. Let's talk a bit more about how to then implement this theory, this idea of groundedness. First, maybe if you could elaborate on the fact that what is really the role for managers and business owners in building this workplace? Do they have responsibility? Can they do something? What's your take on that?
So, all right, I'm going to disclose my bias here, which is that I'm a writer and I love words. So that's my bias. And yet, I think for things like groundedness, the most important thing is that everybody speaks the same language around these practices and around what's happening. So I view my primary job as a writer is to give people language for things that they may feel, they may sense, they may even already know, but they don't yet have words for it. Once you have words for something, then you can wrestle with it, you can share it with others, you can work on it, you can shine a light on that thing in ways that you can't when you don't have words. So I ultimately think the number one thing to do is simply to develop a common language around this. To talk about, well, what does acceptance mean to your organization? What does groundedness mean? I give you my definition. There's other examples in the book of how other people think about it. I'm not telling you what to think. I'm just saying, hey, you should realize this groundedness. It's a very important thing, but how are you going to define it at your organization? How are you going to define vulnerability? What does deep community mean to you? And this way, when you have one-on-ones, when you have all staff meetings, when you survey your organization, you can say, well, how grounded are you feeling? Or where is there more of an opportunity to build deep community? And once you have words for these things, again, then you can do something about them. Then they become real. So there are specific practices and skills and whatnot, and we can go into some of those if you'd like in the book. But I ultimately think before any of that, the first step is just developing a common language around both the problems that we're trying to solve and the challenges we face, and then the solutions.
Yeah.
That's why, again, I'm biased, right? I'm a writer. Like I solve my problems by reading books and then by telling my colleagues, my family, my friends to read the same book, because now suddenly we can all talk about the same thing. And then the problems tend to solve themselves. It's magic. So I think that we need a language for these things. Otherwise, we're just kind of walking around like, oh, I don't feel good. I don't know what's going on here.
Yeah, interesting. I can imagine that just bringing up these conversations can already be very impactful. In the book, you also talk about this idea of durable performance and this idea of, grounded success. What have you seen as the impact on business when they do implement this type of thinking, when they have the conversations, but also do the work on having their employees be more grounded?
Well, what I've seen is that, not surprisingly, and this isn't just me, right? There's lots of research that shows this. Long-term organizational health and performance goes up, and the people in the organization feel better. And an organization is just composed of its people. So if you have people in an organization that don't feel well and don't feel fulfilled, then eventually the performance is going to suffer. Now, there are some companies. Am I allowed to say a curse word or no?
I think so, yes.
There are some companies that are just led by assholes, and they just don't care. I call it parts are parts. So people burn out, people get depressed, people quit. It doesn't matter. Find the next person. That person quits, doesn't matter. Find the next person. There's obviously a lot of selection bias. Those aren't the people that tend to read my work and come to me for help. So if you're not leading with that mentality, then what we see is the more that we can have this kind of grounded excellence as a common language in our organization, the more we can do the work of implementing and practicing it, the better long-term organizational health we have. And we see this in a few ways. The first is less turnover. So turnover is really expensive. You guys are all the business leaders. I don't need to explain to you. Training and finding good talent is the most important thing for an organization, especially a knowledge one where your people are your biggest asset. And losing people is so costly. So turnover goes down, and then goal fulfillment goes up. So it's this huge paradox, right? The less that you're obsessed with achieving some metric, the more likely you are to achieve it, for all the reasons that we talked about and that Steph mentioned. Because when you're just obsessed with achieving the thing, you don't make the right adjustments along the way because you're just barreling ahead. And you might achieve that thing, but then the next goal, you're going to be burnt out. You're not going to have a chance. So I think that those are the two biggest things that we see as leaders and organizations start to adopt these principles and values.
All right. I'm wondering if you have, like, let's say, I know people that want to learn more, obviously go read Brad's book, but do you have maybe one or two exercises? Can be for an individual just wanting to start doing this, but also maybe for a team, like just some real easy.
Yeah, let me give you two examples, right? The first one will be the individual, and then I'll think of the team one. So the individual example, and I write about this in the book, but it's so powerful, is I was coaching this woman, and I'm going to call her Debbie just to blind her identity, right? That's what I call her in the book. And she was recently promoted to be an executive at a multinational company with locations on all 7 continents, so even in Antarctica. And she was Black, a person of color, and she was a woman. And she was the only person of color and the only woman on the executive team. This was like a very good old boys organization. And she felt massive imposter syndrome. And she never even wanted this role. She called herself the accidental executive. She started off as an individual contributor at this company out of undergraduate school. So this was 34 years in the making, just working her way up, doing well, performing well, and now suddenly she's in charge of this company. And a big part of her role was doing the corporate roadshow. So going to different countries and talking about the strategy and getting input from people. And she felt terrible imposter syndrome whenever she took the stage at these big events. She felt nervous. She felt like she didn't belong there. She felt like, why are these people listening to me? And as a result, she was really tight when she was presenting, and the feedback wasn't great from her presentations, this new executive. So I asked her, I said, Debbie, what would it look like to just be honest when you get on the stage? What do you really want to say? And she told me, well, what I really want to say is I'm in over my head. I have no idea what I'm doing. This is terrifying. And I said, all right, well, you're a publicly traded company, so it's probably not the best thing to say verbatim. But how could you be more vulnerable? How could you say something closer to that? And what she said is, I could probably say, well, I feel sometimes like I'm an accidental executive. I can't even imagine how I got here. And as you all in the crowd can imagine, it's really hard. And at times this role can be overwhelming because, of course, I'm a human. I'm not a machine. And that's why I need all of you to engage with me and to help and to give your feedback and to take this strategy seriously, because we have to create it as we go. So she started leading off her talks with remarks like that. And immediately she felt better. She told me it felt like this weight was taken off her shoulder. She could be real. She wasn't up there performing. And somewhat surprisingly to her, though not at all to me, the feedback instrument that they administered after her talks, the ratings went way up. And what made me most proud as a coach is 2 years later, this company did feedback on their executives. They have 8 key executives in a 50,000 person company. And she had the highest rating. And the #1 free text comment was she was the most human of all the executives. That is so powerful, right?
I love the fact of just even, sorry to interrupt you, but just the fact of putting that small nugget of vulnerability up front makes you feel a lot different for the whole presentation, and it made her feel more comfortable as well. So I think it's a great technique. Yeah, super interesting.
And people see her as a human, and then
Yeah.
people can confide in her. So when other VPs at the company, right, these are people that are making $1 million salaries, that have been at the company for years, that have high training costs, when they start suffering, when they're going through a divorce, when they're feeling burnt out, when they don't know what to do, who do they go to? They go to her, because she's humanized herself. So I think as a leader, the practice in the book around vulnerability is ask yourself what you really want to say, and then say as close to that as possible. Again, I'm not asking you, if you're at a publicly traded company, to go out there and say, we're screwed, I'm scared. That's not what shareholders want to hear. But you also don't have to go out there and pretend everything's okay. People see through that.
Love that. So we talked earlier about, you said the first thing to do, like let's say you're an HR manager or you're a business owner and you want to turn this around, you feel like this is not there in your company. You mentioned aligning on the language, but what is another thing you can do to start implementing or moving towards this idea of groundedness?
Yeah, I think that the easiest way to do this, and this is true for individuals too, but definitely for organizations, and this is the work that I've done with organizations, is so once people at the organization read the book and they're bought in, because right, there's tons of research in the book. Like, this isn't just me. This is what the latest science shows. Then the question becomes, we've got the language, we've got the principles. For each principle, what's an organizational practice that we're going to do? So what does it mean to be patient? What does it mean to be present? How are we going to be vulnerable? Like, really getting specific. And I can't tell you what to do, right? Every organization is different. I can just tell you, hey, here's how we define these things. Here's the language. Here's how these things work. But then the practices have to trickle down from the top up. So maybe vulnerability is just that. Maybe it's an organizational practice that leaders take a pause and they ask themselves, like, what's really going on in their head, and then they try to stay as close to that as possible. Maybe for movement, it's walking meetings become a key part of the organization. Maybe for presence, it's that for key meetings, people don't bring their phone or their laptop in the room, or that this notion of deep work becomes organizational language. So it's accepted for someone to block off 90 minutes on their calendar for deep work. Perhaps for community, it is, hey, we're a hybrid or we're a remote organization, but every 2 months we're going to get together, even if when we look at the budget, we see the $100,000 or whatever the cost is to bring people from all over, probably much more. We realize that the long game benefit of this outweighs that cost. So it's taking these principles, believing in them, and then getting really concrete on what are you going to do? What are the norms that are going to help you implement them at your organization?
Yeah, I love that. And I think, like, at Allen, we have defined these things in what we call leadership principles, and people are referring to them even when how we are evolving in the organization. I think that's really good, just doing that definition and then implementing it. Maybe let's move to some questions. I've been seeing some questions pop up in the chat. I saw this first question related to the summit metaphor. I think it's a very good metaphor. So Water asked, what if you don't have clear goals, Summit, in your career, but still feel caught up in a constant push, the rat race? What happens there? So what if you don't have those goals and you're still caught up in the rat race?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways it can be even more challenging, right? Because then you don't have that motivating goal. And that's when it's like, oh my gosh, like, I'm doing all this. What am I doing it for? And there's two ways to address this. And you can probably guess which I prefer. One way is to go find some external goal, to say, hey, I want to be promoted to executive vice president, or I want my company to IPO, or whatever it is. And that's fine. The other way is to find some internal goal and say, hey, even if I don't have this external goal, I don't care about getting promoted. I want to be more self-aware, or I want to be a kinder leader, or I want to be a kind of colleague that people come to when they're in distress. Or I want to do a better job setting boundaries between work and my family life, and then focus on that internal goal. And then that becomes your summit. So what's nice is some summits are defined for us, but we can also define our own summits.
Interesting. Somebody else, Peter Jan, asked, so it's interesting that it can happen to both people who love or stopped loving their job. How can we support colleagues we suspect are struggling?
Yeah. So I think that, well, give them the book and tell them to read it, first thing. But I think that there's a very real trade-off, and I address this explicitly in the book. And people in the workplace talk about acceptance and accepting things as they are. We don't like to acknowledge this trade-off. And here it is. If you are burning the candle at both ends and working 16-hour days, 18-hour days, and just going nuts on work, and you really like it, or you don't like it, and I tell you, hey, Steph, we're going to start setting some boundaries. You're only going to work a 10-hour day. You're going to have some kind of life outside of work. I want you to start taking a 40-minute walk every day. I want you to be able to put your kid to bed at night. And now suddenly, instead of working 16 hours a day, you're working even, let's say, 10 or 11. Still a big day, right? But it's not 16. Guess what's going to happen to your performance over maybe a 1-month period? It's going to go down.
Mm-hmm.
Just simple math.
Yeah.
If you go from working 16 hours to 11, your performance is going to suffer in the short term. But what do you think is going to happen to your performance over a year? It's going to go way up. So the extreme way that I paint this picture is if I want it to be as good as possible and as productive as possible and just go on a crazy spree, I would work 18-hour days. I would drink nothing but Red Bull and espresso. I wouldn't see my family. Maybe I'd shower, but I certainly wouldn't exercise. And guess what? If I did that for 2 weeks, I would crush it. But if I tried to do that kind of effort for a month, for a quarter, for a year, for a decade, I would utterly burn out in flames and the quality of everything I do would suffer. So there's a real trade-off here between if you are working in an unsustainable way, short-term, your observable performance will likely decrease. But long-term, that observable performance will skyrocket. And I think we need to name this. I think it's really important, especially when we help people, right? This is the person that you see that is just crushing themselves and they're doing really well. And maybe they're young, right? They don't know yet. And you're just like, man, the hardest part about this is when they start being a little bit more grounded in their approach, they might get a little bit worse on observable metrics before they get better. And I think that if we can, again, back to language, if we can name this and we can say this is a real trade-off, then when people start to see it, they don't freak out.
Yeah, I love that. And it also reminds me, this new book by Nir Eyal, Indistractable. It's very interesting what he mentions about if you have goals, if you have values, things to work toward, and you block your time accordingly, you're not going to be doing like reactive work all of the time, which can take up like 10 hours of your day if you want it to be. But if you're focused and if you're grounded on this work, you can have a lot less time but perform and have a lot more impact. So that reminded me of it as well. One thing that you might get this question often, I don't know, you like this idea of groundedness. Some people might say, well, yeah, but it's a bit, philosophical. We're talking about Buddha or something. Is it like, wouldn't we be seen as almost soft if we apply these principles? Do we risk our career? I think people might be hesitant. What would you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two things. One is I'd say that the book has over 200 scientific notes in it. So this is where the research is, and I don't design those studies. And then the second thing that I would say is, next month I'm speaking at a facility called Altus, which is a sprint and track and field development group, and they coach over 35 Olympic medalists and hundreds of world champions. And what do they want me to come talk about? Grounded excellence. Not because they don't do it, but the opposite. They're like, finally, like someone's written a book about exactly how we try to like organize around our athletes. So I think the proof is in the pudding, right? When you see scientific research from different fields aligning on or converging on a theme, and then you go out into the world and you see the people that are really doing it the right way over time are practicing these principles, that gives me confidence to say, it will work. And I think the soft hard dichotomy is kind of fake anyways. Like so many of the motivational bros on the internet that are like, crush it, work, be obsessed. You know what those people do for a living? They sit there and they tweet all day. Like, that's not real life.
Mm.
So I think that there's a lot of misconceptions about what actually underlies excellence. Now, you read my book, you'll see like the people I work with, right? I've coached Olympians myself. Like these people, they work their butts off. They work really hard, right? This isn't about checking out at all. This is about being really intentional and focused, making sure that the majority of your work is meaningful, but also playing the long game and realizing that, hey, you want to be good over a year or over a decade, not just any given week.
Yeah, I love that. You talk a lot about focusing on the process instead of being obsessed with the outcome. Do you have any tips or ideas on how to actually do that, how to focus on the process?
Yeah. So this is the one that is it's really simple, but simple doesn't always mean easy. So
Mm.
I think the best way to cultivate a process mindset is once you've set your big goal, figure out the component parts or the steps that you need to hit that goal to achieve it. And if you can, get it down to here's what I need to focus on this month, here's what I need to focus on this week, and maybe even here's what I need to focus on this day. And then this big overwhelming goal becomes so much more attainable because your job is just to show up and do the work that day.
Hmm.
The trite metaphor is a marathon, right? It's 26 miles and you look at 26 miles and it's so overwhelming. But if you just focus on running the mile that you're in, and then at the end of that mile, drink some water, maybe have some energy gel, refocus on the next mile, rinse and repeat, well, suddenly you're towards the end of the race. So yeah, I mean, that's how the best athletes train, right? You look at an Olympian, they're not thinking about the Olympics 4 years down the road. They're thinking about like, what do I have to do this week to put myself in a position to win? So it's taking that big goal and then to an extent, forgetting about the big goal and focusing on the micro steps along the way.
Yeah, interesting. Do you have any tips for Lauren asked, do you have any tips for the restlessness part, the feeling that it's not only work but family, household, friends going to your kine sessions, work at your renovation caught up on you? So this idea that there's always something, this restlessness.
Yeah, I mean, I think that part of it is just like, without knowing details, like if you're renovating a house and you've got young kids and, you're a high performer at work, like it's going to probably feel like you're juggling a lot because you are. So the first thing is just being kind to yourself and saying, yeah, I'm feeling a little restless. Like, no wonder, I've got a million things. And then the second thing is saying, well, can you make small adjustments that free up some time and space? Can you block out 2 hours on a weekend to go for a hike? Maybe you're taking your kid, if they're young, maybe you're carrying them in one of those backpacks. Can you block out 1 hour to put on headphones and listen to your favorite music? These little adjustments that just free up some time and space to decompress a little bit. And then also not always fighting it, like accepting, hey, this is a season of my life that's really full. I got young kids. My company is growing fast. My partner demands that we renovate the house and I caved in. So the next year is just going to be hard. But then at the end of that period, talk with your significant other, talk with your colleagues at work, make sure that you don't get into a cycle where you're always repeating that.
Yeah, I love that. And somebody, Nick in the chat mentioned meditation. In the book, you also give this really cool, like super small exercise. I think it was a breathing exercise. Could be interesting if you could share that because you could do it just right now, basically.
Yeah, so this is the easiest and hardest thing at the same time for people that are feeling restless. So the whole exercise is 3 times a day. Just stop what you're doing and take 5 breaths and focus on your breath. That's it. 3 times a day. So 15 total breaths. And if you're someone that is go, 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 this is going to be so hard for you to do. And that's the point. You want to pay attention to those urges, to that restlessness, to this is taking too much time. And over time, you kind of train yourself that it's okay to have a little bit more space in between the day. So that's it. It's just 3 times a day, 5 deep breaths.
Love that. Very simple. Yes.
If you're laughing at me and saying that's so simple and easy, your challenge is to try it for the next month.
Voila. Just book it in your calendar and do it. There's one I think one or two more questions and then we'll wrap it up. As an HR leader, it can sometimes feel a bit like patronizing to ask these changes in behavior of your teams. How would you advise we motivate our teams to apply more of these principles?
Do it yourself. You
Hmm.
know, you're the leader. Have your own skin in the game. If you've already been doing it, share how it's impacted you. Back to vulnerability. Talk about your own practice. Talk about your own challenges with this. Talk about how hard it might be to just take 5 breaths for you, but also why you think it's really important. So I think the role of a leader is to role model the behavior and then to share in a vulnerable way why and how it's impacted their own life.
Yeah. How do you feel about the direction we are moving into as companies? Do you believe companies are waking up to this idea of mental well-being, of groundedness, or do you feel like we're going in the wrong direction?
I think it depends. You know, that's such a broad question. It depends on the company. It depends on the industry. I think the fact that this book is selling thousands of copies, the fact that Alan has over 400 lives covered, I think shows that that people are paying attention, and I think that's a good thing. And ultimately, I believe that, like, again, the proof is in the pudding. So we'll see that people that practice this end up performing better over the long haul, and that will lead to further adaptation of these concepts in these tools. Unless you're one of those asshole bosses that just doesn't care. And I'm serious though. Like if that's you, then you're not going to like this book, and you're not going to like these principles. And that's just like it's a different audience. But I'm not interested in that audience because I ultimately think that what we work on works on us, and work is a big part of our lives. And I think that I'm here for people that want to take it seriously and want to get fulfillment out of it, but also want to play the long game.
Yeah, love that. Let me just check there if there is some more questions. Charlotte asked, you talk about owning your attention, which is really hard with so many distractions. Do you have any tips to learn to just be without reaching for social media? I think we kind of touched upon it, but maybe you have some
Yeah,
ideas.
we touched upon it a little. They're very like concrete things in the book on this section, but the one that I'll mention that I think is the most important is we think that we need to train ourselves to be more present, and we do, and we can, but our environment is really important. So if you want to be present for something, you can't really have your devices available. Well, what if I'm trying to be present for building a PowerPoint deck on my computer? Then turn off your browser and close your email so you don't even see the little thing in the bottom corner. When I'm doing deep focus work, my phone is in a drawer in another room. Um, I have one day a week where I really want to be offline and there for my family. And I legitimately have my wife, Caitlin, hide my computer and phone so I don't even know where they are. Every Saturday morning, she hides my phone and my computer, and then she gives it back to me Sunday morning. That's what it takes, but that's fine. So I think that where I disagree with someone like Niriel is he thinks that you can train yourself all the way. I think that your environment matters a lot. And we agree on a lot of things, but I think that ultimately, if you want to be present, you've got to set up the conditions to be present.
Love that. Well, I think we had enough questions, and I just want to thank you again for your time, Brad. This was really awesome.
Thank you for having me, Steph. You were a wonderful conversation partner, and thank you everyone that joined for taking taking an interest in this work.
All right, awesome. And thank you everybody for joining. I hope you learned a lot. And of course, we will send the recording after so you can still replay it. And have a great day, everybody.
Take
Bye-bye.
care. Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye-bye.